thank you, Dr. Krishna, for giving me an opportunity to share space with Dr. Tharoor, and congratulations on your book, sir. I've had the opportunity to go through it, at least the important portions of it. And as someone who typically doesn't use a pen to mark on a book, I was forced to do it this time because there are certain aspects that I came across. The one thing that I certainly agree with Dr. Krishna on is that for all practical purposes, my book is perhaps an inadvertent rebuttal of yours. And my book was released on August 13th. Last week was actually the Chennai release, so to speak. And the good thing that I've done, and this is not an attempt at self-edification, is that I have steered clear of all the Hindutva ideologues, so to speak, in building my case, which is that there is no reference to Savarkar whatsoever. There is no reference whatsoever to even Tagore or Gandhi or anybody else for that matter. And let me start with perhaps a factual correction. Kindly indulge me. Hindutva was not coined by Savarkar. Hindutva was coined by Chandranath Boshu in 1892 in his essay on Hindutva specifically. Long before Savarkar actually wrote on the subject, someone had already thought of it and had actually fleshed out its embodiment, so to speak, and Chandranath Boshu. Yes. So Hindutva, unfortunately or fortunately, is attributed to the mind of Savarkar when in fact it's not. So that's the first factual correction. Second, I wouldn't dare use the word criticism because I would be stepping into too large shoes. I wouldn't do that. But my own impression of your book is that perhaps it takes a truncated view of what people crudely dub as Hindu nationalism. I have addressed certain parts of that actually as part of my book. The idea is to place the current movement and the awakening of this particular society within the larger canvas of what global scholarship refers to as decoloniality, which is to basically say that post-colonial societies are trying to shed the baggage of post-colonialism and wear the lens of decoloniality to be able to re-access their past and not recreate their past, but to re-inscribe certain values of the past in the institutions of the present and hopefully chart a more indigenous future. But it's not possible to completely create an indigenous future simply because it happens to be an integrated world. And that's the reality that you have to deal with and actively engage with. So the idea is to create perhaps a hybrid future which has a greater quotient of indigeneity as opposed to coloniality. Let me say this with as much humility as I can marshal at this point, that perhaps your previous book on the British colonial period, as well as this book, completely missed the scholarship of decoloniality because unfortunately, Bharat's experience with colonialism is being approached with a blinkered vision, and I'm making a reference to a general school of thought, and I'm not making this personal at all. Because the idea that Hindu nationalism is fundamentally exclusionist and comes to the detriment of and at the peril of religious minorities in this country is to impose the guilt as well as the framework of European nationalism on Bharatiya consciousness. And every mistake and every folly and every massacre or every genocide which was perpetrated in the name of European nationalism is somehow consciously and unconsciously sought to be transposed onto Bharatiya reawakening. I do not wish to call it Hindutva, I do not wish to call it, any Twa, so to speak. I will simply call it Bharatiya Dharmic Civilizational Reawakening, which is what it translates to. The problem is, unfortunately, whenever this discussion starts, we seem to be fixated with certain personalities, which is Savarkar, so on and so forth. I am happy to completely discard Savarkar, and I'm sure this is going to get me a lot of hate mail, completely discard Savarkar to build a case for Hindu civilizationalism or Dharmic civilizationalism because it is possible to do so. And the concept of Dharmic civilizationalism is much larger than any single individual. And to box it and lay it at the doors entirely of one particular person simply because he comes from an inconvenient political camp, so to speak, or espouses a certain cause that may not be politically correct, would be to do grave injustice to the society using one particular individual as the strawman of the argument. So therefore, it is my position, and I say this with all humility, that with due respect to Sri Savarkar and his contributions, because I've seen the tone as well as the manner in which you refer to him, I'm absolutely sure that it's not possible for us to glorify all parts of any individual. You would agree with that. Be it Mahatma Gandhi, or at least I refer to him as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I choose not to refer to him as Mahatma Gandhi. Pardon me for saying so. Or for the matter, Dr. Ambedkar. I don't think there is a single individual, if you choose to start scrutinizing them, that you would find yourself agreeing with all parts of everything that they say. Be that as it may, you try and make do with those parts which you believe, define them, characterize them. Therefore, for all his flaws or whatever they may be, Savarkar was effectively putting forth a position which was already in public domain, and he was capturing a certain spirit. But be that as it may, I don't wish to be the mouthpiece of Savarkar here. The point is, it is possible, and it must be so, that you look at this particular concept of dharmic civilizationalism independent of the lens of European nationalism. Unfortunately, the moment this discussion starts, I think people start cherry picking certain facts, which is that the constitution is fundamentally antithetical to, or is it loggerheads with, the Hindutva vision of a Hindu Rashtra, so to speak. So perhaps you may want to look at the draft constitution that was presented by the Hindu Mahasabha, which actually promised equal rights to religious minorities. And the reason why this is important for us to point out is because, assuming for a moment that we did not have the concept of contemporary constitutionalism emanating from Europe, even then, Bharat as a civilization has always welcomed those people who are willing to live with us. We did not have a constitution when persecuted Parsis knocked at the doors of Bharat. We did not have a constitution when, let's say, the Jews from your state, so to speak, and even from the Northeast, knocked at the doors of Bharat. So to attribute certain large-heartedness entirely to the constitution, I would say, is to protect the constitution at the expense of the civilization, which I think is grave injustice, grave injustice.
I've never done that.
I'll just finish my point.
When you finish.
So as far as I am concerned, to assume that the constitution is somehow a civilizing tool which seeks to educate and civilize and, let's say, uplift a certain regressive society, which is at loggerheads with the value of constitutionalism, which doesn't know what is democracy, which doesn't know what it is to accommodate minorities, no. It is a product of the fundamental spirit of this particular land, and despite the horrors of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality and tragedy of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality of the two-nation theory, which was specifically foisted on us, which we must never forget, I think this country has done a vastly superior job of protecting its minorities than our former, let's say, estranged cousins, so to speak. And I think the proof of that lies in the fact. So it actually is very, very surprising when we are constantly told that this particular country, if it becomes a Hindu Rashtra, or if it becomes a dharmic civilizational state, so to speak, is bound to become what you refer to in your book as the Hindu Pakistan. I'm sorry, I think that's grave injustice to the people of this country, because accommodation is something, an accommodation, not Western style assimilation. Accommodation has been the spirit of this country, because Western style assimilation requires you to convert to their way of life in one form or the other, either overtly or covertly, in order for you to be accepted as part of the particular society. It is this country that makes it possible for people to keep their culture alive in the most perhaps pristine form possible, so long as it does not come in the way of others. So I would actually make the case that dharmic civilizationalism is what is crudely dubbed as Hindu nationalism. And as a student of constitutional law, not to claim specific expertise or drop names here, I believe that whenever public morality has been referred to in the Constituent Assembly debates, the reference has been to the reservoir of this country's public morality drawn from the vast ocean of dharma. And as far as I understand, the concept of dharma is native to this particular land, so to speak, and its culture. And there is one clarification or correction that I think is very, very important, that it's possible to simply reduce the so-called Indic reawakening, so to speak, as identity politics. It's possible to muddle it to the level of identity politics, in my humble opinion, that would be perhaps the most superficial way of looking at it. Because scholarship, psychology, political science, as well as students of history strike a very clear distinction between identity and consciousness, which is to say you can be a Hindu in name and still think like a foreigner, because your language and your accent and everything could be something that is completely alien to this land. So according to me, identity is less important and consciousness is more important, which is why if I had to choose between an Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh, I would choose a Dara Shikoh simply because in consciousness, he was closer to the Hindu spirit, notwithstanding his identity. But Aurangzeb, for all practical purposes, his consciousness and identity were one and the same and completely antithetical to the nature of this land and its accommodative spirit. So that is the distinction. And the third point that I think needs to be made very, very clearly, because Savarkar's work, whether it is capable of being misinterpreted, misconstrued, or interpreted in the right manner, is not the touchstone of Indic Renaissance, because it is the typical strawman. One of the strawmans that's created is to basically say Hindutva is ethnocentric, it has a certain obsession with race, and therefore in its rejection of religious minorities, it is merely presenting another form of xenophobia. The fact of the matter is this land has accommodated several races, and not all of these races are necessarily native to what we understand as Bharat. They have come from several parts of the world, but have ultimately become part of this particular land simply because their way of life has managed to find a way of coexisting with us without actually having a fundamental principle which sees us as subhuman or dehuman. So anyone who is willing to let go of any particular tenet that has the effect of rendering me a second-class citizen or a second-class human being, forget citizen, is welcome in this particular country so long as he doesn't threaten to sever my roots to this particular land. So the idea which I'm trying to present is that dharmic civilizational reawakening is not a restatement or a sophisticated way of presenting xenophobia or ethnocentrism, because ethnocentrism and xenophobia are the legacies of European style nationalism, not Bharatiyata, so to speak. We have to be understood in terms of our ontology, epistemology, and theology in that particular order, not in terms of anthropology. Anthropology is the obsession of the European Westerner, not of Bharatiyas. These clarifications are extremely important. I'll wait for his rebuttal and then I'll go to the next point.
Shall I? Well, in all fairness, I think you've said some very interesting things, some very provocative, but some that I don't disagree with. And what worries me is that you choose to criticize me on the basis of setting up a straw man of things I haven't said. I've written rather extensively on something. I think I first wrote about Dharma in the Great Indian Novel 40 years ago. And so it's not as if 32 years ago. And so it's not as if these are not issues I've thought about. I have no difficulty with the notion of the dharmic civilizational roots of our culture and of our country, but I would rather follow the Vivekananda view of what Hinduism is all about, as I have explained at some length in the book Why I'm a Hindu, rather than the view that has been encapsulated by Savarkar and his followers, including those who are today in power and who have put Savarkar's portrait in Parliament and hailed him as one of the great icons of Indian nationalism. And the reason is that Vivekananda is very clear. He was extremely proud of his Hinduism. But what was he proud of? He celebrated precisely the inclusiveness of the faith. He said, for example, in Chicago, in that famous series of addresses to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, he said, I'm proud to speak to you on behalf of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance. It's a sentence I read in my teens and that stayed with me all my life, that I kept thinking about. And the more I thought about it, the more profound it struck me as being, because I went to school like most of us studying that tolerance was a good thing, that tolerance was something that you would, a tolerant king is a good king and so on. You learned that in history class. But in fact, tolerance is a basically patronizing idea. It essentially says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will generously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's all that tolerance says. Whereas acceptance, if you like, the Vivekananda view, says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And this, his description of what Hindu civilization and religion and dharma has taught him, is very much what it has taught me. And from that premise, then, I go to a very different conclusion from Sai Deepak's comments. I don't believe that a young Muslim boy being beaten up in the name of love jihad because he loves a Hindu girl is dharmic. I don't believe that a Dalit or three Dalits being whipped within an inch of their life with a belt because they were doing their job of skinning the carcass of a dead cow is dharmic. I don't believe that this poor young fellow, 2 days after his wedding in Bihar, being tied to a tree and essentially flogged to death while being demanded to chant Jai Shri Ram, I don't think that's dharmic. So when we talk in terms of inclusive dharmic civilization, then all I can say is that those forces that have been unleashed in our country in the name of this political philosophy, whatever you call it and whenever it originated, they unfortunately do not represent the virtues of our dharmic civilization as I have learned them from Vivekananda and from many others. I mean, he wasn't alone, and there were many, many interesting exponents of the faith in contemporary times who built on the work of great thinkers and sayers and scholars. I mean, Vivekananda is in a direct line of descent from Adi Shankara. Others have been inspired by many others in the Bhakti movement and so on. So we can go into a detailed discussion, but that's another book. And if you're interested, please read my book, The Hindu Way, or if you're interested in the politics of Hinduism versus Hindutva philosophically, then please read Why I'm a Hindu. But having said all of that, let me come back to this book, which is what I was here to talk to you about. This book does not, in fact, as Sai Deepak seemed to allege, imply that the Constitution is all that we are, or that our civilization has reached its apogee in the Constitution. It's a pretty fine Constitution, highly admired by constitutionalists around the world, but obviously it is the end product of an entire historical evolution. And in our case for millennia, I've forgotten in which book, but I have written that, whereas the Italian nationalist Massimo Tapparelli d'Azeglio in the 19th century, when Italy was created out of a mosaic of principalities and statelets, rather famously said, "We have created Italy, now all we need to do is create Italians." And I wrote that we never had an equivalent of such a thought in India's nationalism, because Nehru and all the others around them, if asked, would have said, India as a civilization, as an entity, as a land, as an idea, has always existed. We are merely giving contemporary expression to the longings of Indians. So there's never any need to create Indians. Indians existed. And in fact, in talking about it, I have argued in many of my writings, and it may even be in this book, that this is not particularly a Hindu idea, though I have great reverence for our dharma, because in fact, whereas as scholars like Diana Eck and so on have said that the territorial configuration of India was essentially sanctified by the endless tracks of pilgrimage from one Hindu shrine to another over literally centuries or even thousands of years, and that's perfectly fine. It's also true that the rest of the world saw us as one, and that, as Maulana Azad pointed out, an Indian Muslim going on the Hajj would be greeted by Arabs, whether he was a Tamil Muslim or a Pathan from the northwest, be greeted as a Hindi, because there was this notion of India or Hind as one coherent civilizational space. So my argument is that it is very, very much something that we can converge upon. Where I'm parting from what I've just heard is in my insistence that recognizing these civilizational values in legal constitutional form by ensuring the equality of all is indeed fundamental to civic nationalism, and is explicitly disavowed by many of the votaries of the kinds of doctrines that Sai Deepak is saying. Now, I must admit that since, like most others, I have also believed that the term Hindutva came with Savarkar's book, The Essentials of Hindutva in 1922, and I'm very happy to discover it's not the case. I have to admit that nobody today espousing Hindutva doctrine has put up any monuments to Chandranath Boshu, whereas Savarkar is very much hailed and recited and presented as the fount of those ideas. And the worry about, of course, Savarkar writing is that he was writing very much at a time when very similar ideas were flourishing in Europe, particularly Italy, Germany, and Portugal and Spain at that time were caught up in very similar notions of ethnic nationalism. And it was no accident that Savarkar described Hindus as a race. He did not use the word religion, he used race because he was writing at a period when these ideas of racial purity were sweeping across Europe at the same time. So that, to my mind, discredited much of the origins of his ideas. But now that Sai Deepak tells me there's somebody else who has had a different understanding of Hindutva in the 1890s, I would be very happy to read him. If, on the other hand, if he has echoed a sort of Hindu-ness, a Hindutva, that speaks to the kind of Hinduism that Swami Vivekananda celebrated, then I have no quarrel with him, whereas I do have a strong quarrel with Savarkar as judged by his writings as well as by the content of his later political life. I think I'll leave the key disagreement to that, because I think that's where Sai Deepak has anchored his arguments, but I see has taken some notes, so I look forward to hearing his counter thrust and to responding to it.
So, in the interest of time, am I audible? Yes. In the interest of time, I will stick to specific points made by Dr. Tharoor. First is that he believes that the Hindutva that he subscribes to, or the Hinduness that he subscribes to, is that of Swami Vivekananda. I'm actually happy you said that, because while Swami Vivekananda was happy to speak of universalism and universal brotherhood from the podium of the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, he was very, very clear that universalism cannot come at the expense of pixelation of history, and certainly specific disagreements, theological disagreements, which resulted in constant practice of exactly this value called toleration, this civilizing, condescending virtue called toleration, which was resulting in the proselytization of Indians en masse. So much so that at least in two of his works, I'm sure you're aware of it, sir, where he specifically refers to his encounter with a Christian missionary on a ship either back to or from India, where a Christian missionary was constantly spewing venom against the religion of Satan, which is Hinduism. Swami Vivekananda, despite his belief in universal brotherhood, was forced to catch the Christian missionary by the scruff of his collar and threaten him with throwing him overboard. If I may say so, that according to me is Hindutva, or Hindu resistance in action, which is to say, I'm more than happy to accommodate all your points of view, provided you first stop spewing venom against me in the name of your scripture. So the very same Swami Vivekananda, I'm so happy that you've actually cited him, also went on to identify in, let's say, book after book after book, in fact in several tomes, the history of invasions from the 8th century at least until the 16th century. And this is something that he has never pixelated. So the great thing about these stalwarts or civilizational icons is that they were very clear that there is no inconsistency between recognition of the universal character of dharma and what dharmic communities and civilizations have been subjected to in the name of vidharma. Let's not call it adharma, let's call it vidharma. This is something that is starkly missing, and that's exactly what I've pointed in my book, which is to say that there is a filter called coloniality or colonial consciousness, which actively prevents this particular country, and specifically the majority of this country, from accessing specific aspects of its past and putting it in deep slumber in the name of secularism. Because just as you have a problem with, let's say, the concept of tolerance, so to speak, European history, and I'm absolutely sure you're aware of this, is specifically clear about the Christian origins and Christian nature of secularism itself. Such being the case, I think when this particular community stands up and says, I have had enough of secularism and I've had enough of this inclusivity that is specifically telling me forget everything, you keep citing Dalits, you keep citing everybody else, but you don't wish to talk about the treatment of Kashmiri Hindus and the specific causes behind it. You don't wish to talk about what exactly has happened in Bengal immediately after elections from the 2nd of May. You don't wish to talk about, let's say, certain pockets being created in Assam in the name of religion, dare I say. You don't wish to talk about what is, according to me, the longest running insurgency in this country, which is the creation of a crown colony in the northeast, and therefore there is Nagalim for something. Please Google up what they specifically are fighting for. It's Nagalim for, and the religious figure is specifically mentioned. With all these insurgencies going on, surprisingly, it is the Hindu who is the constant subject of scrutiny, whereas everybody else is spared scrutiny and the rod. So therefore the point is, the Hindu has proved herself, not himself, herself, because Sabarimala, herself, to be more than open to reform in every possible way, because way before untouchability was abolished under Article 17 of the Constitution, the temple entry movement was initiated by the Maharaja of Travancore in 1936. That was already done. So several people, inward-looking people, were more than happy, if at all the Dharma Shastras warranted it, they were more than happy to say, we have to move on. So therefore, I am merely saying that this particular community perhaps doesn't get the credit that it deserves, and it gets, let's say, more scrutiny than it deserves, whereas everybody else is spared scrutiny. That's point number one. Point number two, any concept must be understood, as Dr. Tharoor rightly points out, in historical context. I completely understand, but it should not be divorced from the unique cultural experience and historical experience of any community. So nationalism, when spouted by a European who is fundamentally a colonizer, is not the same as nationalism from Savarkar or anybody else who is the victim of colonization at the end of the day, who has witnessed two successive waves of colonization running for at least 1400 years. So to say that when we speak of nationalism, it's the same as European supremacism, I'm sorry to say, is to compare apples with oranges, where you're divorcing the entire history and focusing exclusively on the statement. Here, when we speak of nationalism, it is merely a call for throwing off the yoke of colonialism of two kinds. Therefore, this should not be compared with Europeans, for the simple reason that you're comparing the victim with the oppressor and the aggressor. That, according to me, there couldn't have been a greater insult to a victimized and a colonized community. That's point number two. And I'll just make one more point, which is Constitution. Of course, it's a fine document, it's a great document, it must be worshipped. Yes, I get all of that. But the point is, Dr. Ambedkar, after having crafted this constitution, during the Nehruvian dispensation, rues the fact that he actually created this constitution because he was seeing it distorted under the Nehruvian dispensation, and he says very clearly that I regret the day that I was given this particular task of having to draft this particular document, because now I realize that a terrible piece of document can be used for the betterment of the people in the hands of good people, but a fantastic piece of document and legal document can be completely misused in the hands of scoundrels. I don't, and this I'm not even paraphrasing, I'm using his words exactly. So therefore, the fact of the matter is, the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution regretted having to live during his lifetime to see the Constitution and its values being completely thrown to the winds. That's point number three. And the last point that I think is extremely important is the reference to Diana Eck, her book called India, a Sacred Geography. Surprisingly, when she refers to India, a Sacred Geography, she chooses not to refer to it as Bharat. She still focuses on India, which is exactly why I decided to call my book India, that is Bharat, because Article 1 speaks of India, that is Bharat. Unfortunately, Bharat has been effectively relegated to the margins, whereas India is currently surviving at the expense of Bharat. The problem is, if you look at the introduction of Diana Eck's book, because I've had the specific opportunity to deal with it in my book, she recognizes the fact that as far as this country is concerned, it was created as a consequence of a network of pilgrimage centers. And therefore, there's a triple matrix of nature, culture, faith, epistemology, and patriotism coming together to create this entity called Bharat. But there again, she says, but Hindu nationalism, no. So the problem is, it's surprising that she regurgitates the very same scholarship of Radhakumar Mukherjee of 1914. She comes out with the very same scholarship on sacred geography of Jadunath Sarkar, of R.C. Majumdar. But we are more than happy to cite a foreign scholar by the name Diana Eck as opposed to Radhakumar Mukherjee, Jadunath Sarkar or R.C. Majumdar, which according to me is proof of coloniality or colonial consciousness, so to speak, that we still seek the validation of someone sitting in Harvard. So it has to be someone of Indian origin educated abroad, or it has to be preferably a Westerner who is educated abroad, all of them telling us, of course you're great, you have our validation, you have our blessings. So that's exactly why I said perhaps we should have let's say, a face-off as far as India, that is Bharat, and the Battle of Belonging is concerned, simply because Diana Eck represents everything that is wrong with Western academia. She, according to me, represents what's happening on the September 11th, which is dismantling Global Hindutva Conference.
We are not discussing Diana.
I'll leave that.
Let me quickly,
Right.
but very briefly, just touch on these 3-4 points. First, on this question of the word secularism and its English, its European origins, I fully understand, because secularism came up very much in the context of a certain history of church-state relations, and that's where it came from. But I have said in my writings for 30 years that I'm not particularly fond of the word secularism. If you look up an English language dictionary, secularism implies a distancing from religion. Whereas in India, we have practiced secularism to encourage a profusion of religion. So in practice, I say that pluralism is a more appropriate word. Bahuswarata in Malayalam, and I suppose also in Hindi. That we have this diversity in our country that's part of our reality. So secularism is simply shorthand because everyone has been using it for so long, they're used to it. When I say pluralism, I usually get a blank stare, but that's all I mean. The diversity, a variety of people in India, which I think we should all accept. That's certainly what I believe in. On the question of Vivekanand's robust refusal to accept being insulted, I'm 100% with him on that. After all, what does he say? He says, I am proud to speak to you on behalf of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance, which is also a message to people of other faiths. Don't try and tolerate me, accept me. I will accept you. I will accept that you're Jehovah, you're Ahura Mazda, your prophet, Yahweh, or anybody is, as far as I'm concerned, as valid a way of imagining the divine as mine is. He loved quoting the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which essentially says that as various rivers, some crooked, some straight, flow down various mountainsides and end up in the same sea, so also all ways of worship will end up in the same divine. That fundamental idea that Vivekananda made, I would argue, the bedrock of his preaching, and I'm proud to say I've probably read every word the man ever spoke in print, that appeared in print, including obscure speeches in Lahore and here and there. He was the great advantage for me was that, of course, Vivekananda did the bulk of his preaching and writing in English, and therefore I didn't feel I was reading his ideas mediated through a translator, and that made it all the more interesting. But in any case, his ideas were very, very clear, and I have no problem with standing totally and resolutely behind my support for him, because he was not an unself-critical Hindu. Unlike these gentlemen of the day today, or not so gentlemen, who are, in my view, giving my Hinduism and Vivekananda's Hinduism a bad name through their conduct. He was somebody who, for example, he once said, it may astonish you today, 120 years later, he said, I've been wandering through the villages of India as a sadhu seeking alms, but how much better it would be if people like me, if other sadhus would go from village to village teaching science and mathematics. It's so much more useful for India than the spiritual quest in which we're embarked. This is Vivekananda. And I think sometimes we don't recognize that there's been this very healthy reformist inquiring quest within those who are amongst the greatest votaries of Hinduism. So an uncritical defense of every kind of bad behavior that is currently being taken out in the name of Hindutva, and particularly the whataboutery that says we have done bad things, but those guys have also done bad things, to my mind is not the idea. As far as I'm concerned, our duty as Indians is to reform ourselves. And if you want to really bring it down to religion, then as a Hindu, I believe that I would have every entitlement to judge my fellow Hindus when they fall short of the dharmic standards that I've been brought up with. But it's not my place to tell a Muslim how to be a good Muslim or a Christian how to be a good Christian. I can tell them under the Constitution how to be a good citizen, and what of their conduct is not acceptable to me as an Indian citizen. But as a Hindu, my business is only with my fellow Hindus, and if that's the prism through which you want to see the debate, I will continue to criticize Hindus when they misbehave. And I think that those are the three main points. But broadly speaking, let me stress, there has to be some common ground between these views, because ultimately the Constitution is what it is. And we even have the principal votary of Hindutva ideology today, the Prime Minister himself, saying the Constitution is his holy book. So there is a level of acceptance. I've actually asked Mr. Mohan Bhagwat whether he stood by his predecessor's rejection of the Constitution. And he said, look, those were the days when the Constitution was being debated by everybody. I'm not bound by what was said in the 1950s. And if that's truly where he stands, I respect him for that. And he says, okay, his movement will work within the parameters of our Constitution. That's already a very useful meeting ground and a very useful basis on which the government and the opposition should be able to proceed. But I think it's important to recognize that the nation we celebrate has to be an inclusive one, has to be one where nobody is judged by the faith they practice, but by the content of their character, by the behavior that they indulge in, and by the values they stand for. And disagreement within those parameters is entirely acceptable in a diverse democracy. As I've said many years ago, the thing about India that I celebrate, and I said this to foreign audiences, is that in a country like ours, with all the diversities we have, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. To me, those ground rules are the rules established in the Constitution. That's the civic nationalism that I celebrate. And within those rules, we can happily disagree, provided those fundamental rights are not challenged. That a Muslim is not told that somehow he is less legitimate a participant in the national conversation because his gods are found in a country other than this holy land of India. That, to my mind, is not acceptable. To me, from my reading of my faith, my civilization, and my country's history. I think I'll leave it there, but I invite you all to read the book, engage with it, and see for yourself whether the arguments I've made are even partly persuasive. I recognize that many of you are attracted to another point of view, but I think it's important to bear in mind that these ideas are ideas that have come as a product of a somewhat long period of reflection, reading, and immersion in these ideas. They're not offered without thought, so I hope I can offer them to you.
Instead.
My name is Meg Kalyansundaram. I'm director
Sorry?
of. My name is Meg Kalyansundaram.
Hi.
And I'm the director of Indica Classical Library.
Indica?
Indica Classical Library.
Wonderful.
We specialize in ancient Indian texts.
Yes.
Right.
Is this
Congratulations.
similar to the Murthy Classical Library and so on?
A response to it.
I see. So it's different texts, not the same one.
Yes, a different set of texts. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
My questions follow from a reflection. I've read the book fully. It follows from a reflection of section 27 in the book, which is got to do with Kashmir. I have a printout of the political map of India, 10th edition, which was published in 2020 and which is on the Survey of India. And the Constitution 51AC reads, and I quote, "It shall be the duty of every citizen of India to uphold and protect the sovereignty, unity, and integrity of India." So my question is, do you endorse the political map of India published in 2020 unequivocally? Do you, pursuant to Article 51AC, consider it as part of your civic nationalist duty, to use your terminology?
Very, very much. So this is the chapter on Kashmir that
Correct.
Mr. Kalyansundaram is referring to, Jammu and Kashmir.
Right.
And let's face it, if I respect the Constitution, I have to accept the decisions taken by procedures enshrined in the Constitution. As a Democrat, I am entirely entitled to criticize the way in which certain things were done. I have said so in Parliament, and I stand by my words then, and indeed much of what I've said in Parliament is reflected in this chapter, which is that I thought it was a very unworthy sleight of hand by which the constitutional provisions, the letter of the constitutional provisions was followed, but not their spirit. In other words, whereas to amend Article 370, you needed the consent of the state of Kashmir, which is normally a consent given by the elected Legislative Assembly of Kashmir. You sought that consent when the legislature is suspended and the governor you have appointed gives you consent on behalf of Kashmir. That is arguably within the letter of the law, but definitely no one will agree that it is within the spirit of the law. And so on and so forth. In fact, one of my concerns that many Tamil friends have expressed is that the sleight of hand we saw there could be applied to any state of India. Strictly speaking, all you need to do is declare President's rule, kick out the elected assembly even for say 3 months, and then change any sort of provisions relating to that state under the same techniques used to get rid of Article 370. But as for Article 370 itself, I said at the time, and I stand by it, that even those who came up with the provision, including Jawaharlal Nehru, never implied it was a permanent provision. In fact, they specifically listed it as a temporary provision of the Constitution. But the idea was that it would be changed only with the consent of the Kashmiri people as manifested through their elected assembly. And instead we have changed it essentially by unilateral fiat, while I concede holding to the letter of the Constitution. But I've been to Kashmir as recently as a few days ago. I've had a number of conversations with people there. And I think it's time for all of us to move on from that debate now. I mean, I've said what I had to say, and I said it at the time in Parliament, which is my job as an MP. But today, I would be much more inclined to focus on integrating the Kashmiri people, their hearts and minds better into that territorial map you're so proud of. Because honestly, that is what I think is the larger priority. If we want to celebrate our democracy and our unity, that's where we should focus our energies. I had a good conversation with the Lieutenant Governor. I think he's got very clear ideas and is very much hands-on. A lot of things are happening. I hope we'll see elections as well and restoration of elected government. And that the statehood that they're entitled to. I mean, one Kashmiri politician said to me, I want the same statehood as Kerala, not the same statehood as Delhi. And that's fine, there's no Article 370 in Kerala. And as I say, don't focus only on the territorial issue. Let's start giving them every reason to celebrate being part of that territorial map.
Great. So I take it that you endorse the map completely.
Yeah, I mean, it's been passed by the Parliament, signed by the President. It's now part of the Constitution the way it is.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor.
But again, don't forget that even the Home Minister said the Union Territory status is not meant to be permanent.
Yes,
so that's part of that map, but it's
absolutely
not meant to be permanent, and I will continue advocating restoration of statehood.
Correct. That's okay. Thank you. No, you need the mic because it's being broadcast on YouTube and Zoom. So they won't hear you without the mic.
I'm Shashi Sai.
Keep it very close to you.
I'm Shashi Sai and
Much
I'm
better.
a student of information technology.
I'm sorry?
A student of information technology.
Okay.
So on the 23rd, last month, you referred to as the Malabar Hindu genocide as a false memory. What about this is a false
As a?
memory? False memory.
No, I mean, I think what I said was, historians have written reams about all of this. There are multiple views. There are at least 3 different interpretations I can identify about what happened in the so-called Mapla rebellion and so on. There is if you like, the leftist view that it was essentially a class struggle between oppressed peasants and oppressive landlords and the colonial power. It so happened that the oppressed peasants were overwhelmingly Muslim and the oppressive landlords were overwhelmingly Hindu, and that's why the communal coloring. That's one view. There is indeed the view of what you call the Hindu genocide, which sees it very much through the prism of the assaults on Hindus that took place. So that also took place in the later part of the rebellion. The initial rebellion did not have a communal coloring, but I'll concede that aspects of it did gain that. There's also a third view, which points to the complexity of going with either the first or the second view. First of all, the geographical differences. In different parts of Malabar, you had different experiences. There are anecdotes after anecdotes of Muslims sheltering Hindus and Hindus sheltering Muslims and so on. It was not a straightforward, as we've seen frankly in the riots that sadly have benighted our country even in the last 30 years, there have been human beings reaching out across the communal divide, and it was not one of this kind of unquestioning identification with the religious community. And that there was also no doubt about the anti-colonial aspects of many of the stands taken. And therefore, because of the complexity of all this, to reduce these 3, as I said, at least 3, because there are others. I think the Hindu, or one of the papers, I think it was the Hindu, had a rather lengthy article, perhaps in the Kerala edition, that gave all the multiple possibilities. I said that it would be unwise to go for any one of them. Yes, it is a false memory to reduce all of this to just one interpretation. And I think that in many ways, one of the interesting things about history is that you can read multiple accounts of the same events and come to your own conclusions depending on the prism through which you see them. And I will be amongst the first to admit that no one view is necessarily superior to another, but that definitely the duty of the historian is to dig up as much material as available and put it out there, and that after all history writing is subjective. I concede my attack on British colonialism omitted certain good things the British did, or at least that they feel that they were good things that they did, though I don't believe they did them for us. That's another matter. The truth is that in looking at the vast amount of information out there, you select the points and facts that suit a particular narrative, and that's what I think those who take either just the peasants versus landlords view or just the Hindu versus Muslim view are also doing. I think the story is much more complex than either of those narratives.
I respectfully disagree with you, but...
Yeah, sure. But that's the point about history. We can disagree. And you can give me footnoted facts for your interpretation, and I can find the same for you.
On this question, I'd like to weigh in. It's important because I would not be doing justice to my own position on this particular subject if I didn't speak up on the subject. Be it in journalism or history, I think it is currently boxed by the tyranny of what I call forced symmetry and balance, which is to say that you throw up three different views and say all of them are equally valid, and therefore you must leave it to people to choose which of these is most comfortable to their position, as opposed to focusing on the more objective aspects of history which are demonstrable through clear evidence and facts. How do you judge whether an incident has a communal, let's say, flavor to it, or let's say a communal tinge to it or not, is not just on the basis of who was killed and who are the perpetrators, but on the basis of stated goals and intentions. Let us not forget that as far as that movement is concerned, the larger goal was to actually express solidarity with the establishment of the Ottoman Caliphate, so to speak, and to say that the dismantling of that particular caliphate is an attack on Islam, so to speak. Therefore, to say that this was a peasant rebellion, 20 years down the line, we'll have the very same historians saying that because most of the best houses in Kashmir were owned by Kashmiri Hindus, what happened there was again a rebellion of the proletariat, so to speak. That's what we'll be told next. In fact, that theory has already started, that the problem that most of the people had there was because of the affluence of Kashmiri Hindus. Therefore, what happened there was the same thing. You have another line of history basically saying that the person who demolished Somnath 12 times was doing this to effectively free the people from the oppression of the Brahmin there. Even that history has started. So therefore, I'm sorry to say this can't be accepted, because the fact of the matter is there is a clear solidarity with a movement which is Islamic in nature. Second, you see both the Hindu landlords as well as the British colonial masters, so to speak, as co-conspirators who are holding on to lands belonging to a particular religion. Clearly, the communal flavor of that particular entire movement is out in the open. There is really nothing to judge after that. The fact that a few people who were killed also belonged to the same religion of the perpetrators doesn't change the fact that the intentions were clearly communal in nature. Most importantly, it is to the credit of a lot of people who must have sheltered Hindus, no doubt. But let us not obfuscate and indulge in obfuscation when we say that the intention behind the, or let's say the trigger behind the movement was manifestly, avowedly, irrefutably and undoubtedly communal in nature. That is something that must be accepted, because otherwise we will start laying the groundwork for, let's say, for apology for everything that has happened in this country. I mean, if we are absolutely clear about what happened in 2002 in another part of the country, giving it a religious flavor, why is it that we are so hell-bent on whitewashing everything else? I think the only competitor here, I'm sorry, the only competitor here is Asian Paints or Nerolac. They're doing a better job of whitewashing facts.
This incident is not even mentioned in this book.
Just to find middle ground with Dr. Tharoor on this particular issue, unfortunately, I think the twain can meet here, which is building on your argument with respect to the experience of colonization, where you say in principle a sorry is owed as opposed to an amount. I'm applying the very same logic to what has happened to other parts of the country through other dramatis personae. And in any case, wouldn't you rather that you resolve these issues sitting across the table than on the streets?
Oh, definitely. I don't want to be going on the streets.
Therefore, reparatory justice is a concept that is finding traction across the world. We are not even asking for retribution or reparation. We are simply asking for reconciliation. Reconciliation is perhaps the softest possible way of accepting and acknowledging something that has happened. Retribution is terrible. Reparation requires you to set things right. It calls for restitution. But reconciliation says accept, move on so that you don't repeat. That I think is certainly possible.